On a cold Kansas morning in the middle of the Second World War, the most dangerous enemy of America's most advanced bomber was not a Japanese fighter, not anti-aircraft fire over Tokyo, but something far closer and far more humiliating: its own engines. Imagine standing on the flight line watching a gleaming superfortress worth more than $500,000 wartime dollars cook itself alive before it has even left American soil. These are the kinds of hidden stories we uncover here, the forgotten disasters, the quiet fixes, and the ordinary people whose ideas changed history. If you want more true stories like this, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next time a mechanic, a nurse, or a factory worker quietly bends the course of a war. On March 15, 1944, at Pratt Army Airfield in Kansas, Captain Robert Morgan runs up the engines of his B-29 Superfortress, preparing for what should be a routine training evolution. It is not enemy fire that threatens him, but the right inboard engine, a massive radial that suddenly turns traitor. Flames erupt from the No. 3 power plant, the big right radial cooking itself at roughly 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Black smoke boils from the cowling curling over the wing as ground crewmen sprint across the tarmac, fire extinguishers clutched in their hands, dwarfed by the burning bomber towering above them. Morgan reacts by the book. He pulls the mixture to idle cut-off, starves the engine of fuel, and arms the fire suppression system. Bottles of liquefied carbon dioxide discharge, flooding the engine compartment with gas that should smother any blaze. But nothing happens. The flames do not die. They intensify. What the manual cannot show is that the fire is not where the system expects it to be. It is deep in the rear cylinders, hidden behind a forest of cooling fins and metal baffles in spaces that the extinguishing agent simply cannot reach. Inside the cockpit, Morgan shouts the order that every bomber crew trains to obey without hesitation: everybody out. The crew moves like a single organism. They have run this drill again and again until every action is muscle memory. In under a minute, they are off the aircraft, dropping down hatches and scrambling across the ground. They make it clear as the fire trucks arrive, but the airplane itself is doomed. By the time the hoses are in position and foam begins to spray, the bomber is finished. The fire has eaten its way into the wing structure, melted through key spars, and rendered the enormous machine a twisted, sagging carcass that will be written off and stripped for parts. What makes this horror truly chilling is not just the loss of one airframe, but the fact that this is not a combat mission over hostile territory. This is Kansas. This is a training flight. The Superfortress has never crossed an ocean or faced a single enemy fighter, and yet it dies in fire and smoke. Worse, it is not an isolated freak accident. At Smoky Hill Army Airfield, another B-29 burns on the runway. At Walker Field, 2 more ignite during engine run-ups. At Great Bend, one of these giant bombers explodes during takeoff, never even lifting fully into the air, and all 11 men on board are killed before they have any chance to fight back. As the months pass, statistics begin to tell an even darker story. Of the first 175 B-29s delivered to the Army Air Forces, 16 are completely consumed by fire, and another 47 suffer major engine fires. That is an engine failure rate of roughly 35% in the single most expensive weapons program the United States has ever attempted, one that costs even more than the secret effort to build the atomic bomb. General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, has assured President Franklin Roosevelt that these bombers will be striking Japan by June of 1944. At the rate things are going, the B-29 is on track to kill more American air crews in training accidents than Japanese guns will ever manage in combat. Instead of a decisive weapon, it is becoming a flying execution chamber. Everywhere, elite experts throw their best ideas at the problem. Wright Aeronautical Corporation, which builds the engines, deploys teams of engineers. Boeing, which designed the airframe, convenes its brightest minds. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the organization that will one day become the space agency, runs high-altitude tests in its wind tunnels. Yet the solution is not going to come from any of these high-status groups. It will arrive in the hands of a 38-year-old aircraft mechanic with a 7th-grade education, a man whose professional life before the war consisted of crawling through damp, dark basements and installing plumbing in old Cleveland houses. His name is Tony Validor, and his ridiculous idea about pipes will save thousands of lives. To understand why Tony's insight matters, you have to understand the engine that is killing so many crews. On paper, the Wright duplex Cyclone is an engineering marvel, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows, producing around 2,200 horsepower, capable of pushing a loaded superfortress to roughly 350 miles per hour at altitudes around 30,000 feet. In reality, it hides a lethal flaw. The front 9 cylinders sit directly in the stream of incoming air, bathed in the cool rush that enters through the big intake in the nose of the cowling. The rear 9 cylinders crouch in the shadow of that front row, starved for air. During routine operation, temperatures on those rear cylinders climb toward 550 degrees Fahrenheit. During heavy climbs, such as those required for takeoff from short Pacific Island runways, they can surge toward 650 degrees. The aluminum alloy cylinder heads begin to warp at temperatures not much above 500 degrees. Exhaust valves are prone to failure past roughly 575. By 600 degrees and beyond, an entire cylinder can seize the piston, freezing, while the crankshaft still spins at nearly 3,000 revolutions per minute. When that happens, mechanical disaster follows almost instantly. Connecting rods can snap, pistons punch straight through cylinder walls. Hot oil sprays out under pressure onto metal that is already glowing with heat. The engine case itself is made of magnesium alloy, a material that burns with an almost white flame at thousands of degrees, hot enough to devour the aluminum main wing spar in roughly a minute and a half. All this happens deep inside the engine, beyond where any onboard fire system can reach. The bomber may be carrying bottles of carbon dioxide, but those systems were designed to flood a compartment, not quench a blaze erupting inside a block of metal. Boeing's engineers attack the overheating with every conventional tool they can devise. They enlarge the front air intake to capture more cooling flow, but the rear cylinders still cook. They install larger oil coolers and see only modest improvement. They redesign the movable cowl flaps that sit at the back of the cowling, trying new shapes and positions. One new flap configuration allows more air to pass, but the drag penalty is so severe that pilots cannot open the flaps fully during takeoff without sacrificing precious airspeed and lift. It is like putting a giant half-open barn door on the nose of the aircraft. Wright Aeronautical sends its own specialists to study the problem on the ground. They discover that the metal baffles, which are supposed to direct cooling air across the cylinder fins, have extremely tight clearances in places only about half an inch between baffle and fin. Air is being squeezed through narrow slots and choked off exactly where it needs freedom to move. The obvious solution is to redesign the baffles, carve out more space, and open a broader path for cooling flow. But nothing on an airplane exists in isolation. The entire cowling shape is wrapped around that engine geometry. Changing the baffles means changing the cowling. Changing the cowling means revising the wing structure that supports it. Altering the wing means essentially redesigning the entire aircraft. Boeing estimates an 18-month delay and tens of millions of wartime dollars to ripple those changes through the production line. General Arnold does not have 18 months. He barely has 18 weeks. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics brings a complete B-29 to its research laboratory in Cleveland. Engineers mount the bomber's engines in a massive altitude wind tunnel, simulating freezing thin air at 30,000 feet. The results confirm what everyone already suspects: the rear cylinders are suffocating in stagnant, overheated air. The expert consensus hardens into a grim conclusion. The engine is simply generating too much heat in too compact a package. The laws of thermodynamics, as they understand them, are stacked against the program. Without a fundamental redesign of the power plant itself, there is no way in their view to make the duplex Cyclone truly safe. Meanwhile, the war does not slow down. By late 1944, 414 B-29s will have been lost. Fewer than 150 fall to enemy fighters or anti-aircraft guns. The other, roughly 270, are destroyed by engine fires and mechanical failures. The 20th Air Force is losing bombers faster than Boeing can replace them. Crews start to dread their own aircraft. They give the B-29 a grim nickname, the Flying Funeral Pyre. Some men ask to be transferred back to older, slower B-17 Flying Fortresses or B-24 Liberators airplanes that may not have the latest technology, but at least do not tend to burst into flames over friendly territory. While Ph.D. engineers in Dayton, Cleveland, and Wichita run out of ideas, a mechanic on the night shift in a maintenance hangar at Pratt Army Airfield is staring at a partially stripped engine and thinking not about thermodynamics but about plumbing. Antonio Tony Valador was born in the Little Italy neighborhood of Cleveland in 1906. He left school at 14 to help his family, joining his father's small plumbing business. Their work was not glamorous. Tony spent his adolescence crawling through cramped basements, drilling through stubborn brick, trying to snake copper pipes through walls that had not been designed with modern plumbing in mind. Over the years, he learned a truth that no textbook needed to spell out water does not care about what the blueprint says. It cares about gravity, pressure, friction, and the path of least resistance. When a third-floor apartment never gets enough heat, when a line of radiators refuses to warm, the answer is almost never to shout at the pipes and force more water through. The answer is to offer the water an easier path to where it is needed. A well-placed bypass line here, a restriction there, a rerouted elbow in a tight corner, and suddenly everything flows. When the United States enters the war, Tony is in his middle 30s, too old to be drafted into front-line infantry but young enough and skilled enough for defense work. He applies to Curtis Wright, hoping that years of managing steam and water might translate into something useful. They give him a 3-week crash course on aircraft engines and assign him to the maintenance shops at Pratt. Overnight, he is surrounded by aluminum and steel instead of cast iron, and copper by cylinder heads instead of shower heads. But when he looks at the big radial engine, he does not just see metal. He sees a complicated, badly designed plumbing system for air. One night in September 1944, a B-29 limps back to the field with an overheat warning on one engine. The pilot has shut the power plant down before it can catch fire, but the temperature readings are worrying enough that the engine is pulled for inspection. Tony removes the cowling panels and peers into the maze of fins and pipes. The rear cylinders are darkened and discolored, their cooling fins stained the dull burnt shade that tells any mechanic these parts have lived too long at high temperatures. He traces the path that cooling air is supposed to take. Fresh air is meant to rush in through the front intake, bathe the faces of the front cylinder row, and then, driven by pressure, weave its way between baffles and fins to reach the rear row. That is the tidy picture drawn in technical manuals. What Tony sees with his plumber's eye is very different. The front cylinders are acting like heating elements, warming the incoming air to something like 300 degrees before it ever reaches the back. Behind them there is no clear exit path, no obvious way for that hot air to escape. It pools in a stagnant pocket between the rows, getting hotter and hotter, until it is not cooling the rear cylinders at all. It is cooking them. As he stands there with oil on his hands and the smell of scorched metal in his nose, Tony remembers an apartment building on Euclid Avenue where the third-floor radiators stayed stubbornly cold. The hot water, given a choice, flowed easily to the second floor and refused to climb higher because there was no pressure difference to push it. The solution had not been a new furnace or a year-long redesign of the entire heating system. He had fixed it with a simple bypass pipe that gently redirected some of the flow. Now, staring at a bomber engine that is killing American crews over Kansas, Tony begins to wonder what might happen if you treated overheated cylinders not as an abstract thermodynamic puzzle, but as a badly plumbed system that simply needs a better path for its flow. Tony leans deeper into the exposed engine bay, following the pathway the technical manuals claim cooling air is supposed to take. Fresh flow should enter from the big intake at the front of the cowling wash over the forward cylinder row, then pass naturally between the metal fins into the narrow spaces where the rear cylinders sit. It is a clean diagram in theory, but as Tony traces the route with his hands and eyes, he sees a truth that the paperwork never admits. The passages are too tight, the angles too sharp, and the pressure too low. The idealized flow maps drawn by engineers in climate-controlled offices simply do not match the messy tangle of metal he sees before him. Air is not flowing, it is stalling. He understands instantly what that means. The front cylinders do not merely block fresh air, they heat it. By the time the warmed flow reaches the cramped pocket behind them, it is already hot enough to scorch skin, and with no outlet behind the rear row, that same air becomes trapped. Instead of cooling the cylinders, it lingers, baking them like a sealed oven. The more he studies the geometry, the more he sees the problem is not insufficient intake, not insufficient power, but insufficient escape. The engine's own architecture creates a suffocating dead zone, where temperatures climb higher and higher until metal fails and fire erupts. The idealized flow maps drawn by engineers in climate-controlled offices simply do not match the messy tangle of metal he sees before him. Air is not flowing, it is stalling. He understands instantly what that means. The front cylinders do not merely block fresh air, they heat it. By the time the warmed flow reaches the cramped pocket behind them, it is already hot enough to scorch skin. And with no outlet behind the rear row, that same air becomes trapped. As this realization settles over him, his mind jumps decades back to a narrow apartment building on Euclid Avenue, where the tenants on the third floor always complained that their radiators never worked. The boiler in the basement ran hot, the pipes rattled, the gauges rose, but the third floor stayed stubbornly cold. Tony had solved that problem not by forcing more water into the system, but by installing a bypass line. As this realization settles over him, his mind jumps decades back to a narrow apartment building on Euclid Avenue, where the tenants on the third floor always complained that their radiators never worked. The boiler in the basement ran hot, the pipes rattled, the gauges rose, but the third floor stayed stubbornly cold. Tony had solved that problem not by forcing more water into the system, but by installing a bypass line. He is thinking like a plumber, but ideas alone do not cool engines. To test his theory, Tony will need real metal and real parts, and he knows that if he asks for permission, the idea will die in a heartbeat. No superior officer is going to authorize a mechanic with a 7th grade education to re-engineer the most expensive engine in the Air Force, so he works quietly, at night, alone. While other mechanics rest or drink coffee, Tony rummages through the salvage yard behind the hangar collecting bent aluminum tubing from a damaged bomber. He carries the pieces inside, cutting them with a borrowed torch, shaping them with tin snips, drilling holes, and fitting everything together with sheet metal screws. Night after night he builds his crude prototype. The ducts are not elegant. They are not polished. They look nothing like the pristine castings produced by Wright Aeronautical's factories. They look like plumbing because they are plumbing. Small curved pipes that redirect air around the forward cylinders, creating an intentional bypass that feeds fresh pressurized cooling flow directly into the stagnant zone behind the second row. When he holds the assembled pieces up to the engine, he can see the path clearly. It is not pretty, but it is logical. It is simple, and it might just work. With a deep breath and a racing heart, Tony installs the modification on the right inboard engine of a B-29 scheduled for testing the next morning. On the evening of October 3rd, he tightens the final screw wipes, aluminum dust from his hands, and fills out the maintenance log with a short, almost defiant note cooling system inspection complete. He does not tell a soul. He knows the risk. But he also knows what happens every time a B-29 catches fire over Kansas. While other mechanics rest or drink coffee, Tony rummages through the salvage yard behind the hangar collecting bent aluminum tubing from a damaged bomber. He carries the pieces inside, cutting them with a borrowed torch, shaping them with tin snips, drilling holes, and fitting everything together with sheet metal screws. Night after night he builds his crude prototype. The ducts are not elegant. They are not polished. But today it does something no one has ever seen before. It stops, not at 500 degrees, not at 480. It holds steady at around 425 degrees, a temperature that should be impossible under full power. Wheeler frowns, taps the gauge, checks the wiring, and keeps pushing the engine harder. 5 minutes pass. Then 6. The rear cylinders remain cooler than the front ones. The engine refuses to overheat. Wheeler shuts it down, climbs from the cockpit and shakes his head, convinced the instrumentation has failed. The maintenance crew opens the cowling to investigate, and everything changes in an instant. They find the ducts, the pipes, the crude aluminum tunnels that Tony has slipped into the engine without authorization. The engineering officer is furious. His voice echoes across the hangar, demanding to know who committed this unauthorized modification to a combat aircraft engine. Within minutes, Tony is pulled from the line and marched to Major Donald Peterson's office. The interrogation begins. Did he alter the engine? Yes. Did he understand that unauthorized modifications are grounds for court-martial? Yes. Tony answers calmly, without excuse, knowing full well the danger he faces. But when Peterson demands to know why he would violate protocol, Tony asks only one question in return. "Sir, did you see the temperature logs? The rear cylinders ran 60 degrees cooler. The logs sit on Peterson's desk, numbers that should not exist, temperatures far below anything the engineering teams have ever achieved." The Major leans back, torn between discipline and possibility. He points out that the greatest minds in American aviation, experts from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics Engineers, from Wright aeronautical specialists from Boeing, have been battling this problem for nearly 2 years. How could a mechanic from Cleveland solve what the best engineers in the country could not? Tony meets his gaze without flinching, because they are treating it as an engineering problem, but it is a plumbing problem. Silence fills the room. Peterson lifts the papers again, scanning the readings that make no sense. Eventually he picks up the phone. He does not arrest Tony. He does not reprimand him. Instead, he forwards the logs to Wright Field in Dayton, recommending immediate evaluation. It is a wager that might save the entire program or ruin his career if the data is wrong. 2 days later, Tony finds himself boarding a C-47 transport plane carrying his hand-built ducts in a simple canvas bag. When he arrives at Wright Field, he is escorted into a conference room where 12 engineers sit behind a long table. They represent the largest aviation organizations in the nation. Their eyes, filled with skepticism, track him as he enters. To them, he is not an inventor. He is an uncredentialed mechanic who dared to tamper with a precision power plant. The tension in the room thickens when a new figure enters: Colonel Curtis LeMay, the commander of the B-29 campaign in the Pacific. LeMay has no patience for bureaucracy. He has bombers burning on runways thousands of miles from home and crews refusing to fly. He needs a solution. He does not care where it comes from. The meeting begins with Dr. Harrison Evans, one of Wright Aeronautical's most respected engineers, presenting a formal critique. Tony's ducts, he declares, violate basic aerodynamic principles. They create turbulent flow. They reduce total cooling airflow by roughly 8%. They are, by all official calculations, a step backward, not forward. The only possible explanation for Tony's extraordinary test data, Evans insists, is faulty instrumentation. Without missing a beat, Tony opens his canvas bag and places additional temperature logs on the table, data from 3 separate runs, each showing rear cylinders consistently 50 to 65 degrees cooler than baseline. It is impossible to dismiss. The numbers match. The pattern holds. The room shifts uneasily. A Boeing engineer speaks next, arguing that even if the ducts work, they cannot be mass-produced. They are hand-cut, hand-bent, hand-assembled. There are no stress tests, no vibration analysis, no endurance proofs. You cannot bolt untested parts onto engines worth more than $35,000 wartime dollars and send them to combat. It is, he argues, dangerous, irresponsible, and amateur. The debate sharpens, voices rising, arguments colliding. And then Colonel LeMay stands. The room goes silent. He looks first at Tony, then at the engineers, and speaks with the blunt force that has made him infamous. He has B-29s burning on Saipan. He has crews terrified of their own engines. Now he has a mechanic who claims to fix the problem with a few pieces of aluminum tubing, and he has experts claiming the fix cannot work. He asks Dr. Evans how long Wright Aeronautical has been working on the problem. Nearly 2 years. He asks what solutions they have implemented. The silence that follows is the closest thing to an admission of defeat. LeMay lifts Tony's temperature logs. He lays them on the table, and with a single order he changes the course of the war. You are going to take Sergeant Valador's modification. You are going to engineer it properly, and you are going to put it into production. Not in 20 months, not in 20 weeks, in 20 days. The experts stare in disbelief. Tony watches in stunned silence. And the path that began with a broken radiator in a Cleveland apartment now moves toward transforming the deadliest bomber engine in American history. For a long, heavy moment after Colonel Curtis LeMay finishes speaking, no one moves. Only minutes earlier, the discussion had been sliding into open contempt for what several engineers dismissively called cowboy engineering. They had warned that letting line mechanics improvise on engines worth more than $35,000 wartime dollars was a recipe for disaster. that strict process, complex analysis, and centralized authority must always outrank ad hoc fixes, created in maintenance bays. Now, the most feared commander in the bomber force has just sided with the so-called cowboy. The hierarchy of expertise in the room tilts on its axis. LeMay does not waste time on wounded pride. He cuts through the arguments with the blunt edge of operational reality. He tells Tony that he has crews sitting in remote island bases who are more afraid of their own engines than of enemy fighters. Men who stare at rear cylinder gauges with dread because they know that a momentary spike might mean a sheet of flame and a desperate bailout into cold water. Then he turns that same hard gaze on the assembled experts. They insist that the ducts cannot possibly work. He asks one simple question that none of them can answer. If the modification is impossible, why are the temperature logs on his desk so different? When Dr. Harrison Evans admits that Wright Aeronautical has been wrestling with the overheating problem since early 1943, modifying cylinder heads, adjusting baffle clearances, and tweaking cowl flap schedules without achieving a decisive reduction. LeMay makes the contrast explicit. Nearly 20 months of sophisticated engineering have produced increments. One night in a hangar with scrap tubing and a mechanic's stubbornness has produced a drop in rear cylinder temperature of roughly 60 degrees Fahrenheit at full power. It is not the outcome anyone expected, but it is impossible to ignore. So the colonel issues orders that leave no room for misinterpretation. Tony's idea will not remain a crude collection of hand-cut pipes. It will be fully engineered, stress-tested, and if it proves safe, installed on every B-29 as fast as the factories can manage. The engineers are to turn the concept into a production-ready system not in 20 months or even 20 weeks, but in 20 days. Combat operations are gathering like a storm front. LeMay intends to send hundreds of superfortresses across the Pacific, and he refuses to do it with engines that routinely set themselves on fire. Before he leaves the room, LeMay adds one more condition. Tony Valador will remain at Wright Field as a technical consultant. He will stand beside the drafting tables and test cells, answering questions about his design, explaining exactly how and where air must be guided. And the colonel warns the experts in his own clipped way not to smother the simple fix under layers of theoretical complexity. The job is not to prove how clever they are. The job is to stop bombers from burning. From a storyteller's perspective, this is the hinge on which the entire narrative turns. Up to this moment, the B-29 saga has been one of spiraling technical failure and rising fear. From here on, it becomes a story about whether a single practical idea born from years spent crawling through basements can be scaled into a solution for an entire fleet. The real test has nothing to do with one engine on one runway in Kansas. It is whether that engine's behavior can be replicated under the harshest laboratory conditions and later in combat over Japan. The next phase begins on October 15, 1944, at the Wright Field testing facility. Engineers take Tony's rough aluminum ducts and reverse engineer them with the precision of a jeweler copying a crude but powerful charm. They create detailed technical drawings that capture every bend diameter and mounting point. And the path that began with a broken radiator in a Cleveland apartment now moves toward transforming the deadliest bomber engine in American history. For a long, heavy moment after Colonel Curtis LeMay finishes speaking, no one moves. Only minutes earlier, the discussion had been sliding into open contempt for what several engineers dismissively called cowboy engineering. With no modification in place, they run the R3350 at full power for as long as they dare, monitoring every gauge and vibration. The front cylinders settle around an average of roughly 410 degrees Fahrenheit. The rear cylinders, as expected, climb into the danger zone, averaging about 565 degrees and peaking near 627. Under that punishing load, exhaust valves begin to fail at around 73 minutes. Beyond that point, metal damage accelerates and continuing the test risks catastrophic failure that could shatter the engine and destroy the rig. Then they repeat the entire ordeal with Tony's bypass ducts installed. At first glance, the setup looks almost comical. Spidery aluminum tubes snake around and behind the front cylinder row, feeding air into openings cut into the baffles. To an engineer steeped in the conventional wisdom of minimizing flow restriction, the assembly seems guaranteed to worsen cooling, not improve it. Yet the numbers that emerge from the sensors tell a different story. With the ducts in place, the front cylinders average approximately 415 degrees, only a handful of degrees warmer than before. The rear cylinders, however, now sit around 445 degrees on average, with peak temperatures near 478. The difference between front and rear, once a yawning gulf of about 155 degrees, has shrunk to something closer to 30. Time to valve failure under the same brutal full power run is no longer 73 minutes. It stretches past 180 minutes with no failures observed at all. The test crew eventually shuts the engine down not because it is sick, but because they simply do not need to run it any longer. Dr. Evans reruns the calculations again and again, struggling to align theory with reality. Instrumentation is checked, recalibrated, checked again. The same pattern holds. An independent measurement of total cooling airflow through the cowling confirms that strictly by volume the ducts have reduced overall flow by roughly 8%. Less air is moving through the system, yet the engine is running cooler. On paper, it should not be possible. Tony offers his explanation in the same plain language he once used to soothe angry landlords and cold tenants. The issue, he says, is not how much air the system pulls in, but where that air goes. Without the ducts, most flow skims over the easiest paths, sliding past the top of the cowling and across the front row, while leaving a stagnant hot pocket behind the second row. With the ducts, some of that air is forced to follow a less convenient route, pushed into the spaces that were previously starved. Just as a plumber might partially restrict a main line to create pressure in a side branch, the aluminum tubes trade a small loss in total volume for a large gain in effective cooling, where it matters. For several days, the formal engineering teams attempt to improve on Tony's design. They adjust diameters to minimize pressure loss, substitute different materials, and experiment with alternative routing schemes that might simplify manufacturing or reduce turbulence. Each new version goes back into the test cell. Each time the data fails to match the performance of the original concept. Some variants run marginally hotter, others create undesirable vibration frequencies. None deliver the same consistent, deeply reduced rear cylinder temperatures that Tony's plumbing layout achieves. By late October, reality forces a decision. On October 28, Colonel LeMay signs an emergency authorization to implement the system across the fleet. In official technical manuals, it is described as the Validor bypass cooling system. On flight lines and in maintenance sheds, crews simply call the new parts Tony ducts. 2 days later, on October 30th, Boeing receives the engineering drawings. By the middle of November, the company has retooled its production lines so that every new B-29 rolling out of the factory carries the bypass ducts as standard equipment. The real proof, however, will not come from test stands in Ohio or drafting tables in Kansas. It will come from an island in the Western Pacific with combat crews strapped into their seats and enemy territory far beyond the horizon. On November 24, 1944, the first B-29s fitted with Tony's modification land on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. They are assigned to the 73rd Bombardment Wing under LeMay's direct command. Among them is an aircraft named City of Los Angeles, captained by Robert Fitzgerald. The City of Los Angeles is selected for a mission that would have been a nightmare even without the engine's history of overheating. The target is the Musashino aircraft plant near Tokyo, a round trip of roughly 3,000 miles. The mission profile calls for long overwater legs, where an engine failure means ditching into the ocean, high altitude climbs to above 32,000 feet, where the air is thin and cooling is more difficult, and extended periods of high cruise power. In the past, such conditions have been exactly where the R3350 shows its worst tendencies. In the engineer's seat sits Technical Sergeant Mike Romano, a man whose logbook already includes multiple engine fires. He has felt the lurch of a cylinder seizing, seen the sudden spike of rear cylinder temperature needles, and watched flight decks fill with smoke. As Fitzgerald brings the engines to power and the bomber climbs away from Saipan, Romano's eyes lock onto the gauges for the right inboard engine, the one that has always given him trouble. Minutes pass, then hours. In the engineer's seat sits Technical Sergeant Mike Romano, a man whose logbook already includes multiple engine fires. He has felt the lurch of a cylinder seizing, seen the sudden spike of rear cylinder temperature needles, and watched flight decks fill with smoke. As Fitzgerald brings the engines to power and the bomber climbs away from Saipan, Romano's eyes lock onto the gauges for the right inboard engine, the one that has always given him trouble. Minutes pass, then hours. Through the long outbound leg, the bomb run over Musashino, and the long journey back, the modified engine behaves as if it were a different machine entirely. After nearly 9 hours in the air, the city of Los Angeles returns to Saipan. When the crew steps down, Romano heads straight to the right inboard engine. The cooling fins are clean and bright, with no signs of discoloration. There are no burnt oil streaks, no warped metal, no telltale smell of cooked alloy. The crew chief explains that the engine had received the new bypass ducts before the mission. Romano understands perhaps more viscerally than anyone what that means. The nightmare that once haunted his instrument panel has been tamed. Over the next weeks, data pours in from squadrons across the theatre. Before the modification in the months of September and October B, 29 units recorded an average of a little more than 4 engine fires for every 100 flight hours. Nearly 1/5 of engines required early replacement due to thermal damage. Almost 1/3 of missions suffered engine-related aborts, turning carefully planned raids into frustrated returns to base. After the adoption of Tony ducts, the numbers shift dramatically. Engine fires fall to well under 1 per 100 flight hours. Early replacements drop to around 3%. Abort rates sink to roughly 6%. By March of 1945, Boeing has retrofitted more than 2,100 B-29s with the Validor bypass system. Wright Aeronautical incorporates the ducts into every new R-3350 leaving the factory. Monthly losses of superfortresses to engine fires and related mechanical failures, which had hovered around 22 aircraft, fall to approximately 4. Each saved bomber represents 11 men who do not have to bail out into freezing seas or perish in a runway explosion. Each saved engine represents one more mission, completed one more city, reached one more step toward ending the war. All of it traces back to a moment when an irritated landlord in Cleveland complained about cold radiators, and a young plumber learned how to make flow go where it was needed, not where it preferred to go. The numbers coming back from the Pacific are staggering. What began as an improvised set of aluminum tubes hand-cut in a Kansas hangar by a former plumber has now reshaped the fate of an entire air fleet. By the final year of the war, analysts estimate that the Validor bypass system has saved roughly 216 B-29 bombers that would otherwise have been lost to overheating and fire. Those aircraft represent nearly 2,376 crew members whose names never appeared on casualty lists, whose missions were completed rather than aborted, whose families never received grim telegrams. It is almost impossible to believe that a modification built from scrap, driven by intuition rather than advanced degrees, could alter the survival odds of thousands of men scattered across the Pacific sky. With the Superfortress engines finally reliable, the bombing campaign that American strategists envisioned years earlier becomes possible in practice rather than only on maps. Now the B-29 fleet can fly long missions without fear of cylinders seizing or magnesium cases igniting halfway to the target. Entire formations remain intact for hours, climbing to altitude with confidence, crossing vast stretches of ocean and descending over industrial centers that had once felt beyond reach. The United States unleashes sustained firebombing raids that incinerate entire city districts. Japanese war industries, steel mills, aircraft plants, refineries, arsenals, collapse under waves of high-altitude attacks that were previously too risky to attempt. And when the moment arrives for the atomic missions against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there is no question whether a B-29 can complete the journey. The aircraft reaches each destination with engines that run cool and steady, carrying weapons that will change the shape of the world. Yet the Japanese High Command does not grasp the shift immediately. Captured post-war documents reveal a striking misreading of American capability. In the autumn of 1944, Japanese officers believe the B-29 program is failing under the weight of its own mechanical troubles. They track engine fire statistics through intelligence reports, estimate that losses are unsustainable, and predict that the Americans will soon scale back or even suspend long-range bombing operations. They assume that no technological fix could be implemented quickly enough to reverse the trend. Then December arrives. From that month onward, Japanese observers notice a dramatic change. More superfortresses appear over the home islands, flying deeper into Japanese airspace, staying in formation for the entire mission and returning home without falling behind or dropping out. The engines that once betrayed crews now run with a reliability that seems unnatural. Reports filter upward through military channels. Intelligence officers conclude reluctantly but unmistakably that the mechanical vulnerability they had counted on has vanished. One admiral writes that the sudden improvement in American engine dependability marks the moment when Japan's defeat in the air becomes inevitable. The pilots who face the B-29 firsthand feel this shift even more sharply. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces, later recalls that in early 1944 he occasionally watched stragglers drift out of formation as engine temperatures spiked their crews, praying they could coax a dying cylinder. Home. Those wounded bombers provided targets of opportunity for fighters like him, but after the final months of 1944 those opportunities disappear. Sakai remembers B-29 formations maintaining their structure flawlessly for hours. He describes the machines not as fearsome for their guns or their speed, but for their uncanny consistency. Engines that never falter make the bombers extraordinarily difficult to engage. When an aircraft does not fail, it cannot be isolated. And when it cannot be isolated, it cannot be killed. In this way, engine dependability becomes a psychological weapon. Japanese fighter pilots, already strained by shortages of fuel training and parts, now face an enemy aircraft that behaves like an industrial metronome, steady, unyielding, precise. The margin of hope narrows further. The belief that a cylinder might burst or a temperature gauge might race upward, causing a bomber to drift within range, evaporates. Instead, the formations glide overhead in perfect geometric boxes, hour after hour, as if untouched by fatigue, weather, or mechanical chance. Reliability itself becomes a force multiplier. Against this backdrop, the narrator of the story expresses the truth plainly. A simple idea from an unassuming mechanic has saved thousands of lives and helped shape the outcome of the war. He reminds the audience that history often hides its most decisive moments behind technical jargon, bureaucratic memos, or anonymous workshop shifts. Yet here the pivot is unmistakable. Without the Valador bypass system, the B-29 campaign would likely have collapsed under its own weight. With it, an entire theatre of operations transforms. By June of 1945, Europe has been liberated, the Pacific campaign is nearing its end, and Tony Valador is preparing to return to civilian life. At Wright Field, he undergoes discharge processing, filling out paperwork that reduces years of labor and crisis into a handful of short forms. He is offered the Army Commendation Medal, an honor reserved for those whose actions significantly advance the war effort. Tony refuses it without hesitation. He tells the officer presenting the medal that he does not deserve it. He believes the crews who flew through flak storms and darkness are the real heroes. They risked their lives every time a bomb bay opened. He merely kept an engine cool. When the officer insists that Tony's innovation saved entire bomber squadrons, Tony shakes his head. Engineers designed the engine. Pilots braved enemy skies. Ground crews maintained the aircraft. He simply solved a small part of the puzzle. To him, the work was never about glory. It was about fixing something that was broken. He returns to Cleveland, quietly sliding back into the life he knew before the war. He resumes plumbing jobs, repairing leaking pipes, installing heating lines, crawling under sinks, and cutting into old walls that smell faintly of dust and time. His clients have no idea that the man tightening the wrench in their basement once saved more airmen than some decorated generals. He never mentions it. If anyone asks about his time in the service, he says only that he worked as a mechanic. In 1947, a reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer hears rumors about a local plumber who played a crucial role in rescuing the B-29 program. Hoping for a dramatic human interest piece, the journalist approaches Tony for an interview. Tony politely declines. He tells the reporter that the story is not important, that he only did his job like millions of others, and that he does not want to see his name in the paper. The reporter writes the article without Tony's cooperation, but buries it on page 7, where it receives little attention. Meanwhile, in laboratories and factories around the world, Tony's idea begins to take root under different names. Engineers call the concept directed cooling or forced path cooling. They incorporate it into advanced jet engines, including the Pratt & Whitney F135 that powers the Lightning II and the General Electric GE9X, the most powerful commercial turbofan in existence. The same logic appears in air-cooled engines used by general aviation aircraft. None of these systems bear Tony's name, but the principle behind them, forcing flow where nature refuses to send it, remains unmistakably his. Far above Earth, the International Space Station uses cooling loops that Tony would recognize instantly. Spacecraft built for deep space missions rely on bypass lines to route heat away from sensitive instruments. Thermal management systems across aerospace engineering mimic the same idea that once emerged from a memory of cold radiators in Cleveland. Yet the world forgets the origin. Tony's name slips quietly away, buried beneath official terminology and technical gloss. When he dies in 1982 at the age of 76, still working as a plumber, his obituary mentions only that he served as an aircraft mechanic during the Second World War. There is no hint that he saved the lives of thousands of men or helped turn the tide of a global conflict. At his funeral, a small cluster of relatives and neighbors gather to pay respects. One man stands alone near the back, older now, his posture straight, his uniform long retired. After the service, he approaches Tony's son. He explains that he flew B-29s in the Pacific, completing 35 missions that should have claimed his life more than once. He says that he survived because the engines on his aircraft did not catch fire because someone had solved the overheating that once doomed crews without warning. For decades, he searched for the mechanic responsible. Now at last he has come to say thank you. Tony's son is stunned. He tells the pilot that his father never claimed to invent anything. He always said he was just a plumber. The veteran smiles sadly, saying that such humility fits the kind of man who could save thousands and never think it worth mentioning. In the final reflections of the narrator, Tony's story becomes a parable about innovation itself. Great breakthroughs, he argues, do not always emerge from prestigious laboratories or elite institutions. Sometimes they come from people who spend their lives solving practical problems, learning through touch, habit, and intuition rather than through equations. Sometimes the person who sees the truth is not the one with advanced degrees, but the one who has spent years understanding how flow behaves in the real world. Tony's insight can be distilled into a single engineering principle that applies across disciplines when flow chooses the path of least resistance, and that path does not lead to where it is needed. The answer is not to demand compliance, it is to create a better path. That is what he did for the B-29. He looked at a system that refused to behave as expected and carved a new route that made the improbable suddenly possible. And so the story ends where it began, with a plumber from Cleveland who never sought recognition and never claimed brilliance, yet changed the world by applying the simplest wisdom he knew. Tony Valador was not a genius in the conventional sense, nor did he see himself as a hero. He was an ordinary man who understood flow, who respected the stubborn behavior of moving air, and who saw an aircraft engine not as a fortress of precision, but as a piping problem, waiting for a quiet, practical solution. In the vast machinery of war, his contribution remains one of the most extraordinary examples of how a single, modest idea can ripple outward to alter history itself.